Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, I have 12 creepy bedtime stories for you. They're perfect for winding down, with just the right amount of suspense to keep things spooky. So, get cozy, dim the lights, and let's dive in. If you enjoy, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Now, let's get started. When I first moved into this small apartment, everything seemed perfect. Although it wasn't big, the apartment was bright and filled with fresh air, feeling like the peaceful haven I had always dreamed of. There was no wasted space here, but every piece of furniture fit just right: the small picture frames on the walls, the ceramic pieces in the kitchen, and the green plant by the entryway. Every small object brought me a sense of satisfaction. However, it was these everyday objects that, shortly after, began to give me an inexplicable sense of unease. At first, there were only a few subtle changes. For example, the green plant's pot would be slightly out of place. Initially, I didn't think much of it and simply put it back in place, thinking I might have accidentally moved it while cleaning. However, the situation didn't stop there. Books on the shelf would shift slightly as if someone had picked them up and not returned them properly. The spice bottles I kept on the kitchen counter would also be rearranged in the morning. Occasionally, the folds in the curtain seemed to have been pulled again in the night. About 2 weeks later, these changes began to become more pronounced. Each night, I would carefully inspect the objects around the house, hoping to find evidence of my own oversight. Yet, these traces became more frequent, and the changes more subtle. I stacked some books on the coffee table in a tower-like arrangement, only to find them slightly open to a different page the next day. One time, I placed a small note on top of the refrigerator, and the following morning, it had somehow moved to the table. I began to feel an overwhelming sense of pressure, as if an invisible pair of eyes were watching me. So, I secretly marked a few small items, such as drawing faint lines under the plant pot with a pencil or using tape to place an unobtrusive mark on a coaster. The next morning, with a mixture of anticipation and fear, I went to check, and sure enough, the cup on the coffee table had been moved, the marks no longer lined up. My heart raced, and my hands trembled slightly. Could there really be something sharing this apartment with me? To find out, I sprinkled some flour on the kitchen counter, hoping to see traces of movement in the morning. Strangely enough, there were no footprints or handprints, but a small area of the flour seemed to have been slightly smudged, as if someone had gently brushed it with a fingertip. Every night, I would watch these changes under the light, trying to find any reasonable explanation. Finally, on a moonless night, I gathered the courage to stay up late, deciding to observe every corner of the apartment. I sat on the couch, turned off all the lights, leaving only a dim nightlight in the living room casting a warm glow. The silence around was complete, broken only by the ticking clock. The hour hand crept toward midnight, and my eyelids grew heavy when I thought I heard the faint sound of pages turning. I opened my eyes and saw the book on the coffee table flipping open on its own. I held my breath, my heart pounding as if it would leap out of my chest. I wanted to approach the book, to confirm that I wasn't imagining things. Just then, a low sigh seemed to float out from the bedroom, sounding like someone breathing gently, with a touch of weariness and loneliness. I froze, my back to a wall of darkness. Suddenly, my phone screen lit up, reflecting my face. When I looked back, I saw the bedroom door slightly ajar, as if inviting me inside. With a mixture of curiosity and unease, I slowly stepped into the bedroom, glancing around. The room was silent, with no sign of anything unusual. However, as I neared the bedside, I noticed that the picture frame on the nightstand had been turned around, now facing away from me. A chill ran through me, and I nearly bolted out of the room. Just as I was about to turn and leave, the edge of the curtain fluttered slightly, as if stirred by a breeze, though the window was shut. A few days later, I decided to set up surveillance cameras in the apartment, hoping to capture the source of these changes. However, every time I reviewed the footage, the camera would mysteriously black out for a few seconds at night. When the picture returned, the furniture had shifted slightly. There was no suspicious figure in the footage, everything seemed to occur quietly, as though these changes took place in another dimension. After enduring these subtle fears for about a month, I began to develop a delicate understanding of my cohabitant. It never directly harmed me, nor did it bring any obvious threats, it simply reminded me of its presence through these small changes. I began to suspect that perhaps it was merely lonely, seeking a bit of companionship in this small apartment. I stopped marking the positions of objects and ceased checking the cameras. At night, I would occasionally murmur, "Is everything all right today?" The curtain would gently sway in response, as if offering a gentle, reassuring presence. And so, I chose to stay, coexisting with this invisible roommate, neither interfering with the other, yet providing an inexplicable comfort to one another. Since then, whenever night falls, the objects in the room seem to shift slightly, as if silently dancing in the darkness. I no longer try to uncover the secrets behind these changes. Instead, I accept their presence. Perhaps someday, I will leave this apartment, but in my heart, it will always hold a unique memory. The day I moved into my new apartment, most of the neighbors merely glanced at me before returning to their own business. The people here seemed like typical office workers, with no one showing much interest in the new tenant, except the man across the hall. He was a middle-aged man, lean and always dressed in an old gray coat, with a sullen, evasive gaze. When we first met, he stood silently in his doorway, watching me, a faint smile on his lips, though it carried a strange, unsettling quality. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, there were many people coming and going in the building, each with different personalities. However, before long, I began to notice something strange about my neighbor across the hall. Every morning and evening, he would stand in his doorway, seemingly just waiting, though I couldn't imagine what for. What was even more unsettling was that his gaze would always follow me. Whenever I left or entered my apartment, I felt a subtle chill, as though he were secretly watching my every move. One time, I went for a late-night walk specifically to see if he would still be standing in the doorway. Sure enough, the hallway was empty at midnight, but as I returned to my apartment and took out my key, I noticed him staring at me through a crack in his door, his eyes gleaming with an eerie, anxious light in the darkness. At first, I tried to ignore his presence, but he didn't seem to intend to make it easy for me. His behavior grew increasingly strange. Every time I walked out of my apartment, he would watch me through the crack in his door, his gaze cold and unwavering. His door was always left slightly ajar, as if ready to swing open at any moment, waiting for someone to approach. I tried to reassure myself, thinking he was merely curious. It's natural for people to be interested in new neighbors. But things weren't that simple. One night, as I was preparing to turn off the lights and go to bed, I suddenly heard soft footsteps outside, like someone pacing back and forth by my door. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound, and peered through the peephole to see what was happening. My heart pounded in my chest. The man was standing right outside, staring at my door like a statue. A chill ran up my spine, making me freeze in place. He stood there for a full 10 minutes before finally walking away. I couldn't imagine what he could be waiting for outside my door. In the days that followed, I remained on high alert, carefully avoiding any encounter with him. But it was no use. Every time I left my apartment, he would be watching me through the crack in his door, sometimes even standing in the hallway, his gaze fixed on me. One day, I couldn't take it anymore. I approached him directly and asked coldly, "What do you want?" He seemed taken aback, then offered that unsettling smile once again. Without a word, he put a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, and slowly retreated into his apartment. That gesture filled me with dread. His grim smile seemed to convey a warning. I didn't understand what he wanted, but I resolved to avoid him as much as possible. A few nights later, I returned home late after working overtime. The hallway lights were dim, barely illuminating the way forward, but I still saw that familiar silhouette immediately. He stood quietly in front of his door, watching me with a faint look of expectation, as if he knew I would come home at that hour. I tried to remain calm as I passed him, yet I could feel his gaze like a knife against my back. Just as I took out my key and prepared to enter my apartment, he suddenly whispered, "Be careful not to let it in." I froze in place, my heart pounding in confusion. His words made me even more uneasy. What was it? I turned to look at him, but he had already disappeared behind his door, leaving it slightly ajar, swaying as if with a quiet sigh. That night, I stayed up until dawn in a state of inexplicable fear, keeping my windows and doors tightly shut, doing my best to ignore his cryptic words. But it didn't end there. In the days that followed, I began to notice a strange smell in my apartment, a faint scent of mold and something rotting, appearing only at night, as though it seeped in from the hallway. Unable to take it any longer, I called building management, but after inspecting, they found nothing unusual. With no other option, I forced myself to endure it. Gradually, the smell seemed to bring other unsettling changes. Whenever I smelled it, I would hear faint whispers, like someone murmuring in my ear, though I couldn't make out the words. One night, in a half-asleep state, I heard heavy breathing outside my door, growing closer as if it were pacing just outside. I held my breath, listening closely. The sound paused, and then, as if testing, someone lightly knocked on my door. I froze, too terrified to respond. The next morning, I found a small letter outside my door, blank on the outside. Inside, it read, "Don't open the door at night. It's waiting for you." I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from the man across the hall. What was waiting for me? Why did he feel the need to warn me? I was nearly driven mad by the flood of questions. In the days that followed, I became even more cautious, locking my door tightly each night, refusing to step outside. But no matter how hard I tried, every midnight, footsteps would circle my door, accompanied by soft knocks, as if something was waiting for me to open the door. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. Summoning my courage, I went to his door, determined to confront him about what he knew. When the door opened, I was met with darkness. The neighbor stood behind it, as if he had been expecting me. He looked at me silently, his eyes bearing a warning. Slowly, he said, "If you want to stay alive, listen to me, don't open the door." Before I could respond, he closed the door quickly, as if he didn't want to say any more. I returned to my apartment, his words echoing in my mind. That night, I locked my door tightly, silently praying that whatever lay beyond it would leave me in peace. The rain was pouring outside that night, its heavy drops pattering against the window as if playing an eerie melody. I sat on the couch, preparing to dive into a novel I hadn't touched in ages, hoping it would help pass the long evening. Only a single dim lamp lit the room, casting a soft, warm glow that brought a sense of security. But just as I was getting lost in the book, I heard a faint knock at the door. It wasn't loud, yet in the stillness of the night, it sounded unusually clear. I looked up, furrowing my brows in confusion. Who could be knocking at this hour? I didn't respond right away, instead sitting quietly on the couch, straining to listen. The knocking paused for a moment, then resumed, with irregular intervals, almost as if someone was testing my reaction. My heartbeat quickened as various possibilities flashed through my mind, but I still couldn't figure out who might be at my door. After a few seconds, I walked over and tried to look through the peephole. All I could see was a dimly lit hallway, with no sign of anyone outside. The hallway was empty. I felt a twinge of doubt, wondering if perhaps it was just something outside rattling in the wind, or maybe the rain playing tricks on my ears. But as I turned to return to the couch, the knocking came again, this time slower and heavier. I took a deep breath and called out, "Who's there?" My voice echoed through the empty room, sounding louder than I'd intended. No answer came from outside, only the sound of rain continuing to tap against the windows. For the next few minutes, there was no movement at the door. I reassured myself that it was just a prank or my own nerves playing tricks. But just as I was about to settle back on the couch, my phone chimed with a new message. I glanced down, only to see it was from an unknown number, with just one line, "Open the door. I'm waiting." My heart sank, and sweat prickled in my palms. Though the number wasn't saved in my contacts, getting a message like this at such a late hour was deeply unsettling. My mind swirled with confusion, considering different explanations. Was it a prank from a friend? Or a message sent to the wrong number? But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, nothing could explain why such strange things were happening at this hour. I took a deep breath, set my phone aside, and decided to ignore the message, convincing myself it was just a coincidence. Then, just as I was calming down, the knocking resumed, each thud pounding on my already tense nerves with a strange urgency. I fought back the growing fear and cautiously approached the door, this time pressing my ear to it, hoping to hear something more distinct from outside. With my ear against the door, I could make out faint breathing on the other side, slow and heavy, as though someone were standing right there. A chill crept up my spine, and my body stiffened in fear. In a low voice, I asked, "Who is it? If you don't answer, I'm calling the police." As soon as I finished speaking, the breathing stopped, followed by a chilling silence. A few seconds later, my phone vibrated again. It was still the unknown number, this time with 4 words, "Don't call the police. Open the door." This message left me frozen, a mixture of fear and anger swirling within me. I hesitated for a moment, then decided not to respond. As I turned to retreat back to the room, I heard footsteps outside, slowly moving away. Relief started to set in. I thought, perhaps, that the bizarre visitor had finally given up. But not even 5 minutes had passed before the knocking resumed, this time slow and steady, each thud heavier than the last. I couldn't stand it any longer. Rushing back to the bedroom, I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. When the dispatcher answered, I struggled to keep my voice calm as I explained the situation at my door. But as I spoke, the knocking suddenly stopped, and everything fell into an eerie silence. The dispatcher assured me that officers would be sent to check on things and urged me to stay safe until they arrived. After hanging up, I turned on every light in the apartment, my heart still racing. I sat back on the couch, staring intently at the door, dreading the thought that the visitor might force their way inside. About 15 minutes later, I heard footsteps echoing down the hall. A knock sounded on my door. I jumped up and opened it to find 2 officers standing there. They checked the hallway thoroughly, inspecting every corner, but found no one and not even a trace of footprints. For added security, They patrolled the area around my apartment, only leaving once they confirmed everything was clear. My nerves had settled slightly as I closed and locked the door, trying to ease myself back into normalcy. When I returned to the couch and picked up my book, my mind, however, refused to calm down. I kept replaying the soft knocks and the strange messages from the unknown number. Just as I began to question if it all had been a hallucination, my phone screen lit up again. It was still that unknown number. This time, the message was only 3 words: "Open the door." My heart raced, nearly beating out of my chest. My hands shook as I read the message, the words like a dark void, pulling away any last feeling of security I had. I could no longer ignore it. Fear surged within me, and horrible scenarios filled my mind. A few seconds later, the screen lit up again with the same message, repeatedly urging, "Open the door." I quickly muted my phone, my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I stared helplessly at the tightly closed door. I told myself that under no circumstances could I open it. But the knocking outside grew louder and more insistent, as if an invisible force was compelling me to take that fateful step. It was a quiet winter night. The cold wind howled outside, and the tree branches swayed, producing a low, rustling sound. The entire town was shrouded in darkness, with the streetlights casting their lonely glow on the empty streets. I was alone at home, and the silence was so profound that I could almost hear my own breathing. Just as I was about to turn in early, a light, hurried knocking came from the door. I froze for a moment, a hint of confusion crossing my mind. Who would visit at this hour? Especially since the neighbors on this quiet lane rarely disturbed one another. Out of curiosity, I walked to the door and peered through the peephole, but all I could see was the dim hallway, empty of any sign of life. The knocking paused for a few seconds, then resumed with a slow, strange rhythm, as if seeking my attention. I hesitated at the door for a moment before finally deciding to open it. But outside, there was only emptiness, no one in sight, and no trace of anything that could explain the knocking. The hallway was still, with only the distant light in the stairwell flickering faintly. I stepped out, glancing around, but the hallway remained deserted. A chill blew in from outside, and I shivered. After a brief pause, I told myself it must have been some child's prank, and I shut the door, determined not to let it bother me. Back in my room, I tried to calm myself, though an uneasy feeling lingered. The silence inside was oppressive, even the sound of the wind outside seemed sharper. To distract myself, I turned on the television, hoping to fill the room with some noise. But only a few minutes had passed when the knocking started again, this time softer, almost hesitant, as if the visitor didn't want to disturb me but still wanted me to know they were there. I went back to the door, looking out through the peephole once more. Once again, the hallway was empty, with the dim hallway light swaying slightly. Slowly, I released the door handle, my mind racing through all sorts of possibilities. Was someone playing a trick, or was there really something strange lurking in the hallway? The thought sent a chill down my spine. Trying to ignore the strange knocking, I decided to go to bed. Yet, a nagging sense of doubt lingered. Barely minutes after lying down, I heard the gentle tapping again. This time, the sound seemed to echo right by my ear, carrying an eerie rhythm that felt like an unspoken message, as if silently conveying an intention. This time, I was truly scared. I quietly got out of bed, crossed the dimly lit living room, wanting to see if something really was out there. As I approached the door, the knocking abruptly ceased. Pressing my ear against the door, I tried to catch any sound from the other side, but everything was still. I held my breath, listening to every slight movement in the hallway, yet all I heard was my own heartbeat. I couldn't help but wonder if I was imagining things or if my nerves were just on edge. As I turned to go back, my phone buzzed in my hand. Glancing down, I saw a text message from an unknown number. "I'm right outside. Open the door." I froze, my hands beginning to shake. Who would send a message like that in the middle of the night? The words felt like a silent command, urging me to do something I didn't want to do. Taking a deep breath, I tried calling the number, but the line was dead. My anxiety reached its peak as I hurried back to my room, locking the door in an attempt to shut out whatever was outside. But a few minutes later, the knocking resumed, louder this time, with a sense of urgency as though the visitor was losing patience and was now demanding that I open the door. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, but each knock felt like a reminder, something was outside, waiting for me. My phone buzzed again, another text from the same unknown number: "Open the door. I'm here." The words felt more insistent, as if someone were whispering them in my ear. My mind raced, filled with terrifying images, as if an invisible shadow was pressing against the door, waiting for me to open it. Just as I was about to call the police, the knocking suddenly stopped. The room fell silent, as if everything had frozen, with only the sound of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I looked at my phone, feeling a sense of unease as I stared at the message. Just then, my phone buzzed again. Another message from that same number: "I'm leaving, but we'll meet again." The chilling words sent a wave of cold through me, and I could almost see a blurred face in my mind, smiling with a sinister calm. I stood there, motionless, trying to comprehend the intent of this mysterious visitor and why they'd chosen this quiet night to come to my door. Just when I thought it was finally over, the soft knocking returned, this time gentler, like a silent farewell. I dared not move, afraid of what I might see if I opened the door. That night, I couldn't sleep, not until the first light of dawn crept through the window, finally easing the tension. But the memory of that night lingered, leaving a dark shadow deep in my mind. That evening, I returned home to find an unsigned letter in my mailbox. The envelope was old, the paper slightly yellowed. I rarely received letters, mostly bills or advertisements, so this mysterious, aged letter immediately caught my attention. I carefully tore it open, revealing a handwritten note inside. The handwriting was somewhat messy, yet carried a sense of urgency. It read, "You must leave immediately. Whatever you do, don't look back." There was no signature, no further explanation. The words radiated an unshakable tension, making my hand tremble slightly as I held the letter. Sitting on the couch, I kept glancing back at that single line: "You must leave immediately. Whatever you do, don't look back." Each word bore a subtle unease, like a warning of some danger I should never approach. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just someone's prank, yet that dark foreboding loomed over me, impossible to shake. To calm myself, I decided to ignore it, but a few minutes later, a knock came at the door. The sound was light but insistent, different from a casual visitor. My heart raced, and I hesitated, wondering if I should answer. The knock came again, more urgent this time, as if the person needed to see me without delay. I walked over to the door, peered through the peephole, and saw a shadowy figure standing outside. A thin man with a tired look on his face stood there, his eyes slightly glinting as he waited for me to open the door. But the dread in my chest made me pause. I didn't open it. Instead, I asked softly, "Can I help you?" He leaned closer, his voice low. "Something was misplaced. That letter shouldn't be in your hands." His voice was quiet and somewhat weary, tinged with mystery. When he mentioned the letter, my heart skipped a beat, and I immediately recalled the ominous warning. I steadied myself, responding as calmly as I could, "I'm sorry, but I found it in my mailbox." "Are you sure there's no mistake?" The man's eyes darkened briefly before he replied, "If you've seen the letter, then heed the warning." He said nothing more, turned, and disappeared into the dim hallway. I closed the door, my mind tangled with confusion and unease. That night, I couldn't sleep. The letter's warning and the stranger's expression haunted me, lingering as a quiet menace, as if he knew a secret I couldn't begin to understand. Late into the night, the wind outside grew sharper, tapping against the window like invisible hands. Tossing and turning in bed, I felt as if something was slowly approaching. A few days later, I told a friend about the letter. She saw the fatigue on my face and, half skeptical, reassured me not to worry, maybe it was just someone's twisted joke. Hoping to reassure myself, I looked for clues. I spoke to the apartment manager, but he insisted there'd been no recent visitors and that no one had left anything for me. Despite this, the situation didn't end. Days later, as I approached my mailbox again, I found another letter inside. The same aged envelope, the same yellowed paper, as if it had come from another time. My fingers trembled as I opened it, my anxiety building. Once again, there was no signature, but this time the note was even more direct: "You haven't left yet? Leave quickly, or something will happen." This warning felt more urgent than before, as if urging me to make an immediate decision. I glanced around the hallway. It was deserted, but the tension was becoming unbearable. Overcome with confusion, I hurried upstairs, trying to brush off the bizarre events. But that night, I felt as if the walls were closing in, the air heavy with something intangible. The wind outside grew louder, as though something waited just beyond my window, expecting me to make a fatal mistake. In the days that followed, my life grew increasingly unsettled. The letters became my shadow, with each visit to the mailbox revealing that familiar aged envelope. The messages became stranger, hinting at terrifying things. Words like shadow at the door and midnight knock filled me with dread, pushing me to the edge. I barely dared to leave home, and at night, I didn't dare open the door, terrified of what I might encounter. As the letters piled up, I felt my sanity slipping. One night, awakened by a strange noise, I suddenly realized the warnings might be real. I heard faint footsteps in the hallway, lightly moving, pausing at my door as if watching. At first, I tried to ignore it, even covering my ears with my blanket, but the footsteps were like a curse in the dead of night, tapping on my nerves relentlessly. Taking a deep breath, I called the police. When the line connected, there was silence on the other end, as if reaching into another world. A few seconds later, a voice finally whispered, "Remember the letter's words." I immediately hung up, chills spreading over me. My phone buzzed with a new message from the same unknown number: "You haven't left. You'll suffer the consequences." Staring at the screen, an icy dread filled me. I finally realized this wasn't a prank, something was truly warning me. I looked up at the window, and in the darkness, a shadow seemed to be creeping closer, carrying an intense, oppressive presence. I glanced around the silent hallway, dimly lit, empty as if the night itself held its breath. No one had mentioned any strange events, nor could I recall anything out of the ordinary. This letter had simply appeared in my life, without warning. I considered throwing the letter away, telling myself it was a simple prank. But as I looked at the paper again, a sense of unease took hold, as though this warning was no joke. I slipped the letter into my pocket and returned inside, yet the room felt suffocating, the wind outside growing sharper. I stood at the window, my phone buzzing again. The screen lit up with one final message: "Last chance. Leave." My hands shook, my eyes scanning the room as the atmosphere grew strange, laden with an ominous tension. The warning and the whispered threat echoed in my mind: "You'll suffer the consequences." Just then, a soft knock came at the door, steady and deliberate, each knock testing my nerves. I took a few steps back, my heart racing, torn between opening the door and hiding. But the knocking grew louder, as if the visitor had lost patience. Holding my breath, I finally decided to leave. Grabbing my keys and coat, I reached the door and hesitated for a moment before running down the hall. The hallway was empty, but a low murmur followed me, carrying a dark hint of malice: "Next time, you won't be so lucky." I didn't dare look back, fleeing down the stairs and vanishing into the night. The cold wind seemed to come from all sides, carrying an unsolved terror that lingered deep in my heart. Whatever that letter meant, I never wanted to find out. That night, thick fog blanketed the entire town, visibility so low that it was almost impossible to see the road ahead. The glow of the streetlights was swallowed up by the mist, and the streets were eerily quiet, as if the world itself had fallen into silence. The sound of my car's engine echoed down the empty streets as I gripped the steering wheel, carefully watching the road and slowing down to avoid missing any turn. Then, a faint cry came from outside the car, drifting through the fog. It seemed distant yet somehow close. I instinctively leaned in to listen, but there was only the heavy silence of the fog surrounding me. The voice was unclear, carrying a faint tremor that unsettled me. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep inside, I felt a growing sense of unease. I pressed down on the gas pedal, trying to escape this strange fog, but somehow, the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me. The fog thickened, as if guiding me into some unknown space. The silence grew more oppressive, and everything around me was swallowed by the dense mist. Just then, I heard the faint cry again, this time sounding pained, as if someone was pleading for help. I stopped the car and listened closely, feeling conflicted. In the distance, I thought I heard faint footsteps, slow and heavy, each step carrying an odd rhythm as if drawing closer. I held my breath, lowered the window, and looked around, trying to see anything through the fog. But as the mist crept into the car, it brought with it a chill that filled me with dread. Just as I was about to roll up the window, the voice came again, clearer this time, a hoarse, whispering voice: "Don't leave." The voice was raspy and low, sounding as though it came from far away, yet at the same time, right by my ear. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly closed the window, trying to calm myself down. But everything I was experiencing was beyond understanding, and the voice carried a pull, as if it were trying to drag me into some unknown fear. I restarted the engine, telling myself to leave quickly. But after only a few meters, a strange thud startled me, and I stopped. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a shadow flicker in the fog, like a figure slowly approaching. Gripping the steering wheel tightly, my mind raced with worry, my hands drenched in cold sweat. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, convincing myself it was just a trick of fog and night. But just as I moved forward, a soft sigh sounded from the back seat. It was faint but unnaturally clear in the silence around me. I whipped my head around, but the back seat was empty, only the mist swirling softly against the window. I muttered under my breath, "It's just an illusion. Only an illusion." Then, the radio suddenly crackled on, filling the car with static as if searching for a signal. Through the static, a voice came, gasping, "You shouldn't be here. Leave." My heart raced as I frantically shut off the radio, but the voice seemed etched into my mind, Impossible to forget. As I drove, the fog grew denser, blocking every bit of visibility. An overwhelming fatigue settled over me, and my eyelids grew heavy, as though something unseen was sapping my energy. I pinched my arm to stay alert, but the radio hissed to life again, the unsettling voice filling the car. "You need to stop. Don't go any further." The voice carried a note of despair, like a soul trapped in the fog, pleading. Fear and confusion filled my heart, forcing me to slow down, afraid of what might appear ahead. But no matter how I adjusted my speed, the whisper stayed with me, repeating its desperate plea. Suddenly, a sharp honk jolted me awake, and I slammed on the brakes, looking around, searching for another car. But the fog stretched endlessly ahead, and I could see nothing. Just as I tried to start the car again, a figure appeared in the mist, standing still, head down, as if waiting for something. I stared, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. The figure raised its head in silence, though its face was indistinguishable, and I could feel those eyes staring right at me. I tried to reverse, but the car wouldn't respond, as if something had taken control. The figure moved slowly toward me, each step heavy and laden with an ominous weight. In panic, I pressed the car lock button, trying to trap myself inside, hoping this was just a nightmare. But the figure kept approaching, drawing closer until its face was hidden in the mist right by my window. Unable to bear it, I shut my eyes, trying to block out the terrifying sight. Then the whisper returned, gentle but chilling, "You need to go. But don't look back." When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone, and the fog outside seemed to thin. The air felt unnaturally silent, as though all sound had been drained away. I steadied my breathing, gripped the steering wheel, and prepared to leave this haunting place. But as I started the car, a soft sigh echoed once again, louder than before, as though the voice was right behind me. In a final burst of desperation, I floored the gas pedal, racing away from the fog. I drove for what felt like forever, until finally breaking free of the town. Behind me, the fog gradually lifted, and I exhaled in relief, though that whisper still echoed faintly in my mind, as if the voice was still nearby. I kept driving until I was certain I'd left the terrifying area far behind. However, when I got out to check the car, I noticed a faint handprint on the rear window, clear against the mist-covered glass, as though someone had pressed down, leaving an imprint. My blood ran cold. I scanned the empty darkness around me, but everything seemed quiet and untouched, as if nothing had ever happened. The handprint remained there, cold and silent, a reminder that no matter how far I'd gone, the voice in the mist could always find me. That night, I was sitting in the living room, the darkness outside settling in, when my phone suddenly rang. I picked it up, seeing an unfamiliar number displayed on the screen. As I answered, a faint whisper came through, interspersed with static, as if the signal was poor. I said hello a few times, but there was no clear response, just a weak voice, repeating broken words, "Help. Please help me." I paused, a chill creeping up my spine. I tried asking who it was, but the line went dead before I could get a response. Staring at my screen, I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. Was it an accident? A prank? After the call ended, I sat there for a moment, an unsettling feeling settling in my chest. Though I told myself it was probably a joke, the fragmented plea lingered in my mind, as if it carried a desperate urgency. I tried to focus, but the whisper wouldn't let me relax. Minutes later, I decided to call the number back, hoping to get more information. When the call connected, all I could hear was static, followed by silence. Just as I was about to hang up, a faint voice broke through, clearer this time but shaky. "Help. Please. Help me. Where are you? What's happened?" I asked urgently, but the person only repeated the plea, and the call cut off again. I stared at the screen, feeling both confused and uneasy. This strange call for help left me unsettled, as if I were being drawn into something dangerous. A moment later, my phone rang again, the same number appeared on the screen. I hesitated but picked up, listening to the static on the other end as if the signal were breaking up. This time, I could make out other sounds, metal clanging, and someone breathing heavily, as if in pain. Suddenly, the voice repeated the plea, slow and desperate, "Help me. Don't leave." A shiver ran down my spine, and my mind raced with possibilities. Could this be someone missing, calling for help? Or someone trapped in danger, needing rescue? Driven by a mix of curiosity and a sense of responsibility, I searched for information on the number online but found nothing. I sat back down, lost in thought, when the phone screen lit up again. Seeing the same number, my heart raced as I debated whether to answer. Curiosity overcame fear, and I pressed the answer button. This time, there was no static, only an eerie silence, as if something were waiting for me to speak. "Please, tell me where you are. Can I help you? I tried to keep my voice steady, though the dread was growing stronger. After a few seconds, the whisper returned, saying softly, "Help me. They're behind me." I froze, my mind flashing with terrifying images. Who was asking for help? Who were they? I felt as if someone was watching me, and the air around me felt heavier. I tried to keep calm, asking once more for the person's location, but they never gave a clear answer, only repeating the plea. After the call ended, I sat in darkness, my mind spinning with questions and fear. Just as I tried to piece together these fragmented messages, the phone screen lit up with an unknown number. This time, the call played a strange recording, broken and unclear. "Find me. Don't leave. They'll come for you." Hearing this, a chill ran from my feet to my head, leaving me paralyzed. The voice was cold, emotionless, as if declaring my fate. I began to realize I might be caught in something inexplicable, hiding a truth beyond my imagination. In the next hour, the calls came more frequently, each more bizarre. Every time I answered, the voices on the other end were different, sometimes a hurried breath, sometimes low sobs, as if different people were trying to tell me something. But each message was faint and broken, never forming a complete picture, like fragmented memories reaching out to me. Finally, the call stopped. Just when I thought it was over, a message notification appeared on my phone. I opened it and saw a blurry photo of a dark, abandoned factory. In one corner, a shadowy figure seemed to be watching, its outline barely visible. Below the photo was a single line, "Last chance, help me." I held my breath, my hands shaking, an overwhelming sense of dread closing in on me. The abandoned factory looked hauntingly familiar, like somewhere I had seen before. I tried to recall the place, but the memory stayed just out of reach, leaving only a vague feeling. I searched for abandoned locations on my phone's map and finally found a factory that looked similar, not far away. After hesitating, I decided to go. My heart pounded with fear and uncertainty, but I knew that if I didn't go, this would haunt me forever. As I drove toward the factory, my heart raced. The night was silent, only the wind whispering around me, as if warning me to turn back. I stopped outside, staring at the shadowed outline of the building, a deep chill settling over me. I took a deep breath and gathered my courage, pushing open the factory's heavy, creaking door. The sound echoed through the quiet night, unnerving in the stillness. I walked cautiously into the dimly lit warehouse, holding up my phone's faint light to see. Suddenly, my phone vibrated. It was that same unknown number. I answered, hearing a faint, distorted voice whisper, "Hurry. They're coming. Save me." The voice was close, almost in my ear, yet distorted and wrong. I tried to ask where they were, but just then, the signal died, and my light went out. Darkness engulfed me, broken only by slow, heavy footsteps coming closer, filling the air with a suffocating dread. I held my breath, feeling a gaze from somewhere in the dark. Just as I turned to flee, the voice whispered one last time, "It's too late." I sprinted back to my car, barely locking the doors before starting the engine and speeding away. But when I got home, my phone screen lit up with another message, "You didn't save him. Next time, don't waste time." That night, I lay awake, realizing, no matter how far I ran, this missing call would follow me like a curse, an unbreakable shadow I'd never escape. Late that night, I was alone in my apartment, the silence thick enough to hear the ticking of the wall clock. Just as I was about to turn off the lights and go to bed, I heard a strange noise from next door. It was a low, slow sound, like furniture being dragged, accompanied by soft footsteps that echoed intermittently in the night. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just my neighbor moving things around. But after a while, the sound abruptly stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the building. A few seconds later, I heard a faint tapping on the other side of the wall, soft and rhythmic, as if in some strange cadence. I lay in bed, listening to the sound, my heart beginning to race as unsettling thoughts crept into my mind. The tapping went on for about 10 minutes, then stopped. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it was over. But just as I tried to drift off to sleep, I heard slow, heavy footsteps from the other side, this time closer, as if they were right next to my bed's headboard. Holding my breath, I listened intently and could faintly make out footsteps shuffling back and forth along the wall, almost as though they were seeping through from within, carrying a strange, suffocating pressure. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination. Yet, the footsteps grew louder, turning into a dragging sound, as if something heavy were being pulled slowly along the floor. The sound sent a chill down my spine, and my mind conjured disturbing images, as though something ominous were lurking behind the thin wall, trying to break through. Eventually, the noise subsided, and silence returned once more. But just as I started to relax, there was a sudden, dull thud against the wall, vibrating the entire surface. I jolted upright, staring blankly at the wall in confusion. This wasn't a noise one would normally hear from a neighbor, it felt intentional, like someone trying to get my attention. I got out of bed, pressed my ear to the cold wall, and tried to listen more closely. Just then, I heard a deep, labored breathing from the other side, muffled and heavy, with an indescribable eeriness. I froze in place, my heart racing. The breathing came again, with a strangled quality as if someone was in extreme pain, struggling on the other side. Sweat dampened my palms as my mind raced with terrifying possibilities. I tried to reassure myself it was just my imagination or maybe my neighbor's strange habits. But the unease was unshakable, as though something truly unfathomable lurked on the other side. Trying to compose myself, I returned to bed, determined to ignore these bizarre sounds. But soon after I lay down, a low, mournful whisper came from behind the wall. The voice was faint, tinged with sorrow, as though speaking directly to me, its words lost in a broken, stilted murmur. A chill crept down my back, and I fought the urge to flee the room. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called building management. The receptionist assured me they'd send someone to check right away. But soon after I hung up, the whisper stopped, and the silence returned, as if everything had been a figment of my imagination. I sat on my bed, waiting for someone from the management office to knock, trying to steady my nerves. Minutes dragged by, and there was no movement in the hallway. I began to wonder if anyone would come. Just then, my phone screen lit up with a new message: stop listening to the sounds on the other side of the wall. I froze, overwhelmed by a terror I couldn't explain. Who would send a message like that, especially now? The sender appeared as unknown, adding to my dread. I tried to call the number back, but it was unreachable. At that moment, countless questions flooded my mind, each more troubling than the last. Just as I struggled to understand, the tapping resumed. This time, it was slow, each knock laden with an unspoken intent. I held my breath, listening intently, caught between fear and curiosity. Moving closer to the wall, I listened to each tap. Suddenly, the sound stopped, replaced by a raspy whisper with an eerie tone, muttering, "You should leave." I jumped back, my heart pounding. Just then, the maintenance worker finally knocked on my door. I hurried to let him in, relieved to see someone else in the room. He asked me in a low voice, "What sounds did you hear?" I nodded, leading him to the wall, hoping he'd hear the unsettling noises too. The worker stood beside the wall, listening carefully for a few minutes but heard nothing unusual. He gave me a small smile, suggesting it might just be noise traveling from another floor, advising me not to worry. I nodded, pretending to be reassured, but the uncertainty lingered. After he left, I locked the door, and the silence returned once more. Exhausted, I climbed into bed, trying to let myself sleep. Just as I closed my eyes, the familiar tapping resumed, slow and steady, as if reminding me that it had never truly left. I lay there, paralyzed by fear, staring at the wall and unable to bear these eerie sounds any longer. Summoning my courage, I tapped lightly on the wall, as if to respond to whatever was behind it. Instantly, the tapping stopped, and a heavy silence fell over the room. I let out a shaky breath, until a low, raspy laughter seeped from the other side, faint and broken, turning into a strange, mournful wail as if something were struggling to escape. My phone vibrated suddenly, and I looked down to see another message from the unknown number: "It's too late for you." The chilling words filled me with dread. Just then, a heavy thud shook the wall as if something was trying to break through, while message notifications began flooding my screen, each one saying the same thing: "Don't turn around." I held my breath, fixated on the phone screen, terrified to look back. Finally, I gathered the strength to flee the room, but the dull thuds followed me, echoing as if to remind me that no matter how far I ran, the sounds from next door would never truly leave. That night, I had worked late and was heading to the office elevator alone. The corridor was deserted, dimly lit by a few flickering lights. I pressed the elevator button, and as the door slowly opened, the cabin stood empty. I stepped in, pressed the button for the ground floor, and the doors closed slowly. As the elevator began its descent, I glanced down at my phone, but in that moment, the elevator jolted violently, then abruptly stopped. I looked up to see the floor indicator numbers jumping erratically, as if out of control. I pressed every button, but the elevator remained unresponsive, a haunting silence blanketing the small space. I stood there, feeling the air grow heavy, my heart pounding faster. Glancing at the display, I watched as the floor numbers continued to jump randomly, sometimes showing 7, then skipping to 2, even flashing strange symbols at times. I pressed the buttons repeatedly, but nothing worked, as if I were trapped in some unknown realm. Trying to stay calm, I took a deep breath and pressed the emergency call button. After a few seconds, I heard a faint voice from the operator. "Hello, how can I assist you?" I quickly responded, explaining that the elevator was malfunctioning and had stopped. But her voice was garbled, filled with strange static, as though coming from far away. I strained to listen, but her voice faded away, replaced by a low, humming static, like a cut-off connection. I repeatedly shouted hello, hoping to reconnect, but all I heard was the unsettling hum, echoing eerily in the confined space. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker, growing dimmer and dimmer. I held my breath, staring as the lights dimmed, cold sweat forming on my palms. Then the elevator was plunged into darkness, the only light now coming from my phone. I pulled it out, trying to use the faint glow to see around me, only to find no signal displayed on the screen. I tried sending a message to a friend, but each attempt failed, as if this space were cut off entirely from the outside world. I shone my phone light on the control panel, seeing that the flickering symbols seemed to form a strange, unreadable character, cold, foreign, and disturbingly captivating, as though trying to communicate a hidden message. I don't know how long passed, but suddenly, I heard a faint whisper in the elevator, like someone murmuring in my ear. I looked around in terror, realizing I was the only one in this tiny space. The voice was broken, incomprehensible, as if coming from somewhere far away, barely audible. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and shone it around, but all I saw were cold elevator walls and the closed doors. I was about to pound on the doors, hoping to signal for help, when the floor display suddenly flashed 13. My heart dropped. There was no 13th floor in this building. I told myself it was just a glitch, but the whispering grew clearer, as if it were right next to me. I stared at the elevator doors, willing them to open. After a few seconds, they slid open to reveal a dark, decayed hallway. The walls were peeling, lights dim, the air heavy with the smell of dust, as though it had been abandoned for years. I hesitated, feeling a deep unease that told me this place was anything but normal. The doors began to close, and I quickly hit the open button, not wanting to be trapped in this eerie space. But when the doors opened again, a different hallway stretched out before me, littered with debris and dirt, the air thick with silence, seeming to stretch endlessly. I shone my phone's light down the corridor, only to see rows of doors and tattered fabric fluttering in the distance, as if an unseen force were urging me to step out. I retreated back into the elevator, frantically pressing buttons, hoping to return to a normal floor. But no matter what I pressed, the elevator stayed still. The display would occasionally flash 13 or show other strange symbols, as if relaying an indecipherable message. Desperation set in, and I felt on the verge of giving up. Just then, the elevator lights flickered back on. The whispers faded, replaced by a low, heavy breathing, as if something was approaching me. Instinctively, I backed into the corner, my heart racing, my phone trembling in my hand. Just as the fear was becoming unbearable, the doors slid open again, but this time, there was no hallway, only pitch-black darkness, a void that seemed to extend infinitely. I held my breath, staring into the blackness, my mind racing, desperate to escape, yet unsure how. As I hesitated, a deep voice whispered, "Hurry. It's waiting for you." Startled, I turned, but the elevator was empty. Looking up, I saw the display flash back to the first floor, and the elevator resumed its descent. I breathed a sigh of relief, clutching my phone tightly, hoping to finally reach a familiar floor. The elevator reached the first floor, and the doors slid open. The lobby outside was deserted, dim lights casting shadows across the floor. I hurried out of the elevator, moving quickly across the lobby. But just as I reached the exit, the low whisper echoed in my ear again, "You've returned, but this is only the beginning." My steps faltered, a chilling dread washing over me. Slowly, I turned around. The elevator doors were slightly ajar, darkness pooling inside, as though that stifling void were waiting for me to come closer. Just then, my phone lit up with a new message from an unknown sender. "Did you really think you escaped?" Reading the message, my hands began to shake. The lobby lights flickered, and as I looked around, the entire space felt warped, as though no exit could lead back outside. My heart pounded wildly, barely able to keep me upright. I rushed toward the door, only to find the glass entrance unyielding, trapping me in this space. Just as despair crept in, I heard that familiar elevator ding from behind me. I couldn't help but glance back. The doors opened slowly, the shadowy display now flashing the number 13. The low whisper returned, this time with a cold, mocking tone, "Welcome back. 12. That day, I had just moved into this rented apartment. Though small, it was clean and tidy, with a window overlooking the distant street view bathed in sunlight, giving a warm, inviting illusion. But as soon as I put down my bags, the eerie silence began to set in. The whole building felt empty, not a single sound in the hallway, and even the bustle from the street below seemed distant and faint. As night fell, the atmosphere in the room subtly changed. I was ready to enjoy the rare solitude when a soft tapping suddenly came from the window, as if someone were gently knocking on the glass. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked outside, only to see the solitary streetlight in the empty street under the night sky, with no sign of anyone there. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind still replaying that tapping sound, my palms slightly sweating. Taking a deep breath, I reassured myself it was just an illusion in the new surroundings, probably just tree branches swaying and tapping against the glass. But the unease lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't fade, and the air in the room felt increasingly oppressive. I tried to distract myself, opening my suitcase to organize my belongings. The room was eerily quiet, with only the rustling of clothes filling the silence. I slowed down, scanning the room, and suddenly realized there were no sounds at all. Normally, there'd be faint noises from the hallway or the distant street, but the stillness felt unnervingly strange. After unpacking, I sat on the bed and scrolled through my phone. But before long, I heard a faint rustling near my ear, like something moving inside the wall. I looked around, trying to locate the sound, my heartbeat quickening, and felt as though the room didn't entirely belong to me. The sound faded after a few seconds, and the air returned to its eerie silence, as if it had all been a figment of my imagination. I told myself it was probably the pipes in the old building, but the unease only grew, a lingering feeling that something I couldn't see was in the room with me. Night deepened, and only the faint glow of my phone lit the room. Curled up in bed, I tried to calm myself. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a soft tapping. This time, it wasn't coming from the window but the wall, clear and rhythmic. Holding my breath, I listened carefully, feeling as though the sound was gradually moving closer, inching toward the bed. Frozen in fear, I lay still, my eyes glued to the ceiling, willing myself to ignore the strange sound. The tapping persisted for a while, then stopped, and I finally felt relief. But just a few seconds later, I heard a soft whispering near my ear, faint and indistinct, like it was coming from another realm. Unable to bear it any longer, I sat up and grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight to illuminate the room. The light swept across each corner, but the room was empty. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself, and put my phone back on the nightstand, attempting to go back to sleep. I had barely closed my eyes when the whispering returned, now clearer, repeating something over and over in a low, chilling tone. I strained to make out the words, but they remained just beyond comprehension, drifting through the room like an unseen presence, chilling me to the bone. I forced myself up, wanting to trace the source of the sound. Just as I sat up, a deep thud came from the wall, making the nightstand tremble. I stared wide-eyed at the wall, fear flooding through me, rendering me unable to think clearly. Finally, unable to take it anymore, I walked up to the wall and knocked hard, hoping to frighten whatever was there. But the moment I stopped knocking, the wall responded with even more intense pounding, as though something on the other side was knocking back, urgently, angrily. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, my hands and feet trembling. The knocking continued for a few seconds before abruptly stopping, and the room fell back into an eerie silence. I hesitated, considering calling the police, but the thought of trying to explain such inexplicable events made me dismiss the idea. I returned to bed, tightly wrapping myself in the blanket, trying to ignore the noises. But the fear persisted, a sense of being watched from somewhere in the dark. The hours crawled by in silence, and I lay there unable to sleep. Every now and then, faint sounds would reach my ears, like someone was pacing around, whispering to me. When I tried to close my eyes, I suddenly felt a soft breath near my ear, icy and close, as if someone were right beside me. I snapped my eyes open, scanning the room in terror, but it was empty. Yet the cold presence lingered, surrounding me, like an invisible entity inching closer with hostile intent. I hugged myself tightly, trying to calm my pounding heart, feeling a weight pressing in, as though there was no escape. I didn't sleep a wink that night, haunted by faint whispers with an irresistible pull, urging me to leave this room. As dawn approached, the whispering finally ceased, leaving only the sound of my own breathing in the quiet room. Exhausted, I sat up and looked around, trying to reassure myself that whatever it was had left. Just then, my phone lit up with a new message from an unknown number. Hands trembling, I opened the message and saw a single line of text: "I'll always be here, waiting for you to come back." A shiver ran through me as I read the words. I quickly gathered my belongings and fled the room, not daring to look back. The moment I stepped out of the apartment, the cool morning air washed over me, bringing a sense of relief. But as I glanced back up at the window, I glimpsed a pair of cold, indifferent eyes peering from behind the curtain, watching me, as if whispering, "You can't escape." That night, I was already half asleep in bed, the room shrouded in silence with only the occasional passing car casting faint light across the window. Just as I was about to fully drift off, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night, it was unnervingly clear. I froze, a twinge of confusion and unease filling my mind. Who could be knocking at this hour? I lived in a relatively secluded area where neighbors rarely interacted. Holding my breath, I waited, hoping it was just my imagination. But the knock came again, this time more insistent, as if someone was anxiously awaiting a response. I sat up in bed, my heartbeat quickening as the knocking persisted, growing louder in the quiet night. Forcing myself to stay calm, I quietly made my way to the door and peered through the peephole. The dim hallway light cast faint shadows, and I could just barely make out a figure standing outside, though the angle prevented me from seeing their face clearly. A wave of apprehension washed over me, and I decided not to respond, hoping they would assume no one was home and leave soon. Yet, the knocking didn't stop. Instead, it grew more urgent, the sound conveying an unsettling determination, as if they wouldn't leave until I opened the door. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath and telling myself to ignore it. But a strange premonition gnawed at me, making it impossible to stay calm. Somehow, I felt that this visitor was here for something I didn't want to find out. Minutes passed, and at last, the knocking stopped, the silence outside seeming to return to normal. I felt a wave of relief. Just as I was about to step away from the door, my phone screen suddenly lit up with a notification, a message from an unknown number. "I know you're home. Open the door." A chill ran down my spine as I read the words. How did they know I was inside? And, more disturbingly, how did they have my number? Confused and unsettled, I stayed rooted in place, hardly daring to breathe, hoping they would give up. But just as I was beginning to feel a faint glimmer of hope, my phone screen lit up again. Another message from the unknown number: "Don't be afraid. I just want to talk." I stared at the screen, feeling a cold sense of dread settle over me. How could this person possibly know my current state of mind? And "don't be afraid" sounded more like a threat, as if they knew I was terrified and were enjoying it. Lost in uncertainty, I heard a sound outside the door again, but this time it wasn't a knock. It was a low, indistinct murmur, almost mocking, meant to disturb me. The voice drifted through the door, broken and intermittent, as though it were designed to toy with me, leaving me deeply unsettled. My palms began to sweat, and I considered calling the police, though I worried that it might provoke a stronger reaction from them. At that moment, I heard the door handle turn slightly, a faint click that sent my heart into a panicked rhythm. I pressed against the door, gripping the handle tightly to keep it from opening, straining to hold it shut. As I held the handle, I could hear the sound of someone's breath just beyond the door, deep and steady, as if they were only a thin barrier away from me. After a few tense moments, the sound suddenly ceased, and silence once again filled the air. Slowly, I released the door handle, taking cautious steps backward. Just as I thought it might be over, my phone vibrated again, displaying another message from the same unknown number. This time, it simply said, "Goodbye." I stared at the words in shock, my mind racing through countless scenarios. Before I could fully process the message, a heavy thud echoed through the room, shaking the door slightly. I looked back at the door, listening as the thuds continued, each one more aggressive than the last. Panicked, I retreated to the far side of the room, clutching my phone as my mind raced, paralyzed by fear. Then, suddenly, the pounding stopped. Silence descended once more, broken only by my ragged breathing. I waited, feeling every nerve in my body on edge. As I finally started to think it was over, my phone lit up again with a new message, this time, no words, just an image. It was a blurred photo of the hallway outside my door, clearly taken just moments before. A faint reflection of light showed on the floor, confirming it was recent. The realization struck me, whoever it was, they were still outside, watching me. I held my breath, afraid of making even the slightest sound. A few seconds later, another message came through. This time, it was a photo of the building stairwell, shadows stretching eerily in the dim light. It was as if this person was trying to show me that they hadn't truly left, that they were still lurking somewhere in the building, waiting for a reaction. Terrified, I carefully approached the door, trying to see if I could catch a glimpse outside. But then, from the end of the hallway, I heard a faint whisper, almost like it was calling my name. The moment I heard it, a cold sweat covered my back, and I was frozen in place. The voice carried an eerie familiarity, as though the person knew me, or knew how I would react. Steeling myself, I forced myself to keep moving toward the door. Just as I reached it, my phone vibrated again. This time, the message on the screen read, "Open the door. Don't make me come in." I was at my breaking point, my hands trembling with fear. I leaned against the door, listening for any sign of movement outside. As I held my breath, the knocking resumed, soft and barely audible this time, as though inviting me to respond. Then, the sound changed to a faint scratching, like fingernails dragging slowly across the door, filling the air with a chilling presence. Unable to bear it, I retreated to the other side of the room, still shaken. Just as I decided to call the police, another message appeared on my phone: "Don't call. No one will come to help." That message shattered any remaining composure I had. I stared at the screen, hardly able to believe what I was reading. Just then, the sound outside the door began again, not as a knock or whisper, but a slow, unsettling hum, like someone singing in an eerie, rhythmic chant, reminding me that they hadn't really left. The air was thick with an oppressive fear I couldn't shake. I paced the room, trying to calm myself, but the movements outside only heightened my anxiety. Minutes later, my phone vibrated once more with a single message: "No matter where you go, I'll find you." Finally, the noises outside the door stopped, and silence returned, so complete it was as if nothing had happened. Gripping my phone, I stood there, immobilized, barely breathing. Gathering what courage I had left, I approached the door and looked out through the peephole. The hallway was empty, only the dim hallway light casting long shadows, and an eerie quiet hung in the air. Slowly, I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack, trying to confirm they had left. But as I did, I noticed something on the floor just outside my door, a photograph. I picked it up and saw it was a picture of my bedroom, taken from an angle that suggested it was captured from outside my window, with a cold and invasive gaze. On the back of the photo, a line of handwriting read, "I'll be back. Don't forget." A chill spread through me, and I slammed the door, leaving every light on. Even as the first light of dawn crept into the room, I couldn't shake the sense of dread. The memory of that night's shadows lingered, and the words on the back of that photo became an indelible nightmare. That night, I had just finished a long day at work and returned home exhausted. The hallway was eerily quiet, with only the occasional sound of footsteps from upstairs and a faint dripping noise from the pipes. As I reached for my keys to open the door, a deep, dragging sound echoed from the far end of the corridor, as though something heavy was being moved across the floor. I froze, listening closely as a sense of unease crept over me. The sound came intermittently from the other end of the hallway, like something was slowly shifting. Oddly, I didn't hear any footsteps, just that heavy dragging noise, growing louder and more disturbing in the silence of the night. I stood still at the door, hesitating to put the key in the lock. The dragging noise continued, coming from somewhere down the hall, sounding as though it was both approaching and pausing. I swallowed hard, convincing myself it was likely a neighbor moving furniture, but an inexplicable sense of dread lingered. The hallway lights flickered occasionally, making the moment feel even more unsettling. After a few minutes, the noise seemed to fade. I let out a sigh of relief and moved to insert the key when the dragging sound suddenly became clear again, as though it was now closer. I stopped, listening intently, my heartbeat quickening. Was it a trick of my mind? How could the sound be coming closer to me? A few moments later, I couldn't resist. I glanced cautiously down the hallway. It was dimly lit, empty of any person. Yet the dragging continued, somehow emanating from an unseen place. In an instant, a chill ran up my spine, and cold sweat trickled down my back. Holding my breath, I stood motionless, trying to avoid making any sound, even the slightest movement. The noise grew sharper, pressing in with an inexplicable heaviness. Was it an illusion? Or something I didn't dare to imagine? My mind raced with unsettling thoughts, and my heartbeat sped up until it felt suffocating. Just as I decided to ignore the sound and open the door, the dragging ceased. The hallway fell silent as if it were holding its breath. I glanced down at the key in my hand, questioning whether I was overreacting. However, just as I released my grip on the key, I heard a soft tapping sound on the door, as though someone was gently knocking. My eyes widened, and I nearly dropped the keys. Was I imagining this? I tried to stay calm, resisting the urge to respond, but then the knock came again, soft but unmistakable. I held my breath, taking a few steps back from the door, afraid to get too close. My mind was in chaos as I tried to convince myself that a neighbor had simply mistaken my door for theirs. But at this hour, who would knock on my door? The knocks didn't sound like an ordinary visit, it was more like a strange test, as if the person outside wasn't in a hurry to see me but rather trying to confirm if I was home. With my back against the wall, my heart beat faster. The knocking paused, and silence returned to the hallway. Just as I started to feel a bit relieved, my phone screen lit up with a new message. I glanced down, feeling a chill run through me. It was from an unknown number. "I know you're home." A cold shiver passed over me. This number, I'd never seen it before. Could it be the person outside? My heartbeat pounded so hard I could barely think. I debated responding when another message immediately followed. "Why won't you open the door?" I stared at the screen, my fingers trembling slightly, unsure of what to do. The terror was paralyzing, leaving me unable to even consider calling the police. Dark thoughts crept through my mind, the feeling that whoever was at the door was watching my every move, with a purpose, a threat I couldn't ignore. Minutes later, the silence returned, interrupted only by the phone's glowing messages, a reminder that this was no hallucination. I told myself it must be a prank, trying to steady my nerves. Yet the unease remained, stubbornly persisting in the pit of my stomach. After a while, I heard light footsteps outside, pacing back and forth. The steps grew closer, then farther away, with an odd, calculated rhythm, as though deliberately crafted to unsettle me. Cold sweat ran down my forehead as I gritted my teeth, trying desperately not to make a sound. Just as I held my breath, the phone lit up again with a message, this time just 3 words: "I'm still here." My heart nearly stopped, and I stood frozen, hands clammy, back stiff, unable to respond. The dim hallway stretched endlessly in front of me, becoming more oppressive with every message. I leaned against the door, straining to catch any sound from the other side. But, strangely, the footsteps had stopped, and the hallway was cloaked in silence, leaving only the sound of my pounding heart in my ears. Finally, the silence stretched on, as if whatever had been outside had given up. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage, and peeked through the peephole. The empty hallway was bathed in dim, flickering light, no one in sight. Just as I tried to relax, my phone lit up again with a new message. This time, the content sent a chill down my spine. A blurry photo appeared on the screen, showing the hallway outside my door. The image seemed to be taken from a distance, just far enough to reveal my door's outline in the peephole. Whoever took it had been watching the entrance from the shadows, without my noticing. A dreadful coldness swept over me. Who was this person? How did they have my number? And why were they still in the hallway, knowing that I was just behind the door? The closeness of the danger clouded my mind. I couldn't bear to stay near the door. I stepped back into the room, gripping my phone even tighter. Thoughts of calling the police crossed my mind, but before I could dial, my phone lit up once more. This time, the message was blunt: "Open the door, don't make me wait too long." I stared at the screen, heart pounding, hands shaking, and my mind racing with fear. I retreated to the far end of the room, no longer daring to approach the door. Yet again, my phone lit up with a voice message this time. I hesitated, frozen with terror and curiosity, fingers hovering over the screen. Finally, I pressed play with a trembling finger. In my ear, I heard a faint breathing sound, restrained and deliberate, as if someone were holding back their excitement. Then, after a few seconds, a low voice whispered, chillingly close, "I'm right here, waiting outside." That voice carried a cold, chilling undertone, as though it were reaching out from the darkness, striking my heart with sheer terror. I gasped, placing my phone down, pressing my back against the wall, feeling the cold sweat on my palms as the darkness deepened around me. In that moment of panic, a sudden knocking at the door echoed again, louder and more urgent. My nerves shattered, my heartbeat thundered in my ears. I fled to the farthest corner of the room, locking my eyes on the door as if the thin panel could somehow shield me from the thing on the other side. My phone lit up again, displaying a simple message: "You think you can hide?" Those words tore through my last shred of composure. Gripping my phone, my hands shaking, my heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. Suddenly, the door rattled violently as if something were pounding it with relentless force, refusing to give up. Teeth clenched, I felt close to breaking under the sound's assault. The hammering finally stopped, and silence cloaked the hallway once more. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. Just as I thought it might be over, a cold draft drifted under the door, carrying an otherworldly chill. I clutched my phone, too terrified to approach. The screen lit up one last time with a message: "I'm right behind you." I couldn't help but tremble, the chill behind me seeped into my bones. Frozen in terror, I didn't dare look back, afraid of what might be lurking in the shadows. The air thickened, pressing down on me, with unseen eyes piercing the darkness. Summoning every ounce of courage, I bolted from the room, fleeing the horror that filled that night. With the break of dawn, I vowed never to return to that place. But whenever I think back to that night, that cold message and the last knock echo in my mind, as if the presence were waiting, biding its time for my return.